Ladies and gentlemen, this evening on The Unconventional Pastor, Bob Greaves will be discussing perception and reality, or maybe the perception of reality, or maybe the reality of our perception. I'm sorry, I'm very confused right now. Maybe Bob can clear it all up as he always does. In just a moment on The Unconventional Pastor.
Well, good evening. I'm Bob Greaves, and they call me the Unconventional Pastor. Great to be back with you tonight, and I'm looking forward to tonight's show. Now, you may have noticed, if you came expecting to see Phil, Phil isn't with us tonight. Actually, Phil is on his way to a wedding, and he's not actually on his way yet. But he has to get ready for it, pack, and do some things, and he's leaving out of town. And so he said, I am so pushed for time, and he works all day, and so tonight is the time he has to be getting ready for that. And so I told him, well, I'll only hate him for 6 days, and I'll love him again next week. So hopefully Phil will be back again next week. And he really apologizes and hopes that you will continue to love him, and I'm sure you will. Anyhow, so I always knew that there could be things that would come up, so I'm not entirely unprepared. And so tonight I intend to actually talk a bit about, as Joey was telling you, perception and reality. Now, this for me was a huge discovery when I began to understand some of the practical implications of the differences between perception and reality. I mean, it's one thing to recognize that they're different, but to begin to appreciate the implications in a practical way is a little different. In fact, I teach, as some of you may know, at the college level, and I teach a few courses. One of the courses that I teach is the science of sound. And, we talk about the physical properties of these periodic variations of atmospheric pressure that we call sound. And we talk about how that energy of sound travels through the air, what it does, and how it diffuses in rarefax, and all these other scientific words that we use. And we talk about transmission loss through various different kinds of solid substances. And so we try to give the person who's on their way to becoming a sound engineer an understanding of what's actually really going on in reality concerning sound. But we don't just teach that, I also have to teach them about the psychoacoustics of sound. And that is, we have discovered that there are things about sound, for example, that we experience that aren't real. We experience it, but it doesn't happen that way. So we talk about such things as psychoacoustics, spatiality, combination tones, beats, masking, and a variety of other aspects that have to do with the psychoacoustics of sound in how we perceive things differently than they are. We talk about the Fletcher-Munson graph, which shows how, depending on the overall volume or average volume of something that we're hearing, our sense of its EQ flatness is radically different. Psychoacoustic, we hear it differently, even though in the air it isn't. And of course, part of the reason I talk about that, and if I've lost you already with the technology, don't worry, because it isn't important for tonight. Part of the reason I teach them this is because if they're going to become really good sound engineers, they need to know that when they're in the recording studio and we have a problem, they have to know the difference between how that problem is perceived and what it really is. If they have a low wattage amplifier and in the session room it sounds, like it doesn't have quite enough bass and maybe not enough of the upper end, Don't start solving it by tweaking the tone on the amp. You might find that you put your microphone in front of it, that it's just because it's not filling the room to your ear satisfaction, that your ear can't hear the bass that's really there. You begin tweaking the bass on the amp, and then you put that microphone in front of it, listen to it in the monitors in the control room, and suddenly it's just way muddy. So you can't go by perception. When you're solving problems, you have to deal with the reality and recognize that perception may not always be accurate. Now, of course, as sound engineers, they have to solve problems in reality so that the end product involves something that we can perceive and hear and experience in a way we enjoy, or in a way that's meaningful or useful for the particular product we're trying to work on. Anyhow, the point being is that I make a big point in that class out of recognizing the difference between the perception of sound and the reality of sound. And, this is not just true with sound. It's true in just about everything in life, that we live in reality in that we are here. We live in reality in that the things that happen obey the laws of physics, but we don't live in reality in terms of our grasp, our awareness, and the way that we experience it. Instead, we live in perception. And from that standpoint of perception, reality may be the laws and the rules of reality as they operate in the interaction of things, but perception is where we live. And it's important to know this and to discover some of the practical and pragmatic differences that therefore brings into play when we think about things like solving our problems. Now, part of what made me think about this tonight is when someone had been telling me recently that something, by the way, I've heard so many times, but I haven't heard it in a long time. And so when I heard it again, I realized I haven't heard that in so long. And what they told me was this, Jesus is the answer. And I got to tell you something. If you know me, you know that I like Jesus. I believe Jesus was a real historical person. I admire him. I think he had a lot of great things to say. I think he was a wonderful human being. I think his impact in being here was wonderful. And I consider myself, I would call myself a Jesuist. That is, I'm a person who really thinks that paying attention to who Jesus was, what he did, what he said, and who it is that he is or may even be, even to the degree I can't understand it, is something worth my time, worth my while. I'm a believer. But when people say that Jesus is the answer, I got to be honest with you that sometimes I don't know what that means. I don't understand it. And sometimes when I even try to understand what they mean by it, I'm not so sure I like what they mean by it. And so Jesus is the answer. It seems like they want to oftentimes even talk about begging the question. They want to kind of almost invent the question. And but either way, I would agree that there is a sense in which Jesus is the answer. But I see Jesus as the answer in this way. And we'll get back to this business of perception versus reality. That I see Jesus as someone who came as an instead Messiah. He came to a culture and a society that was looking for a promised Messiah. And he came not actually as their promised Messiah, but as a representative of the reality of God. And Jesus said things like, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Jesus came to show us that the perception of Yahweh and the reality of Yahweh are completely different things. Jesus is the answer to Yahweh. So that's one way in which I guess I do see Jesus as the answer. I have to regret, though, that he's been turned into someone who's really a perfect fulfillment of the prophecies of the Old Testament. And then the New Testament really basically take a lot of the psychological and sociological garbage of unhealthy thinking and emotional mess and inappropriate social powers. And they just kind of borrow a lot of that and work it into a new system and call it the New Testament, which I think in many ways fails to properly even represent Jesus as I see it. And it just Jesus came to kind of do away with religion, show us what it really ought to be like to acknowledge who God is, or to reach out to him, to believe in him. And then they just turn it into another religion. What a disappointment. But anyway, this was part of that perception versus reality thing as I see it. Now, as I stop to think about it, how did we ever get into this position where we as human beings can even have such a thing as a problem between perception and reality? Well, this isn't something that should be too difficult to figure out. Some of the things that we could say about it, hopefully, would be very clear and obvious once we point them out. I hope that they would be. And by the way, that's usually a good way to try to do things. And I try to do this. I don't always succeed. When I want to share an idea, many times, I will spend time studying, investigating, researching, and coming up with concepts and ideas and learning, buzzwords and insights and do a lot of this reading. And when I come away from it with perhaps a technological appreciation for what is being argued and said and what insights I might be drawing. But I find that although that may be helpful for me in my studying and my attempting to grasp something, I can't really share that stuff. You can't, because when you start sharing that stuff, the only people who understand it are other people who also research and study and do all that other stuff. And that's not everybody. So what I try to do when I can, don't always succeed at it, like I said, is I try to find ways in which that which is verified and validated by insight and study and deep consideration and critical thinking, and I try to find ways in which it really relates to things that feel like common sense, so that when you finally express them, you try to express them as if you just say it as something very simple, so that we can all go, well, duh, of course. Yeah, that's it. A very clear picture. But common sense doesn't really exist that way. It just feels that way. But when we can take some of these complex issues and express them as if they resonated like common sense, that sometimes is helpful. I hope I can do that tonight, if I haven't lost you already. But when we grow up, as we come into this world, we come into this world as organisms. We're just human beings, and as finite little centers of consciousness. We don't know anything. We just have sensory perception, and it comes at us. And from what we understand about even the neurological wiring of the brain, that even our sensory perception is merely wired to the neurological network in a manner where most of it comes to the brain as completely random, meaningless information. Yeah, the things that you see with your eyes come to the back of the brain, and the back of the brain receives the neurological impulses that come to it, but they actually radically mean nothing. But as we gain experience, we begin to discover the correlation the information we're receiving has to its meaning. We can, and part of the way we know that is because of the way that people go through rehabilitation after a brain-damaging accident and some of the things that they report. And also, we can do weird experiments. For example, we could take a person and put a set of the glasses on them that break up their visual field, so that what they see here is now over here, and what they used to see here is now over there, and what they see there is now over here. In other words, we can jumble up their visual field. And when they put these glasses on, they can't make sense of anything. It's just a jumble. But if they wear those glasses and don't take them off, after 3 days or so, their brain begins remapping things until seeing it this way begins to take its place, and it begins to make perceptual sense. And then they can actually grow so accustomed to it that if they take the glasses off, now it's all jumbled again, which indicates that the brain actually learns to create the spatiality out of the relationships that it considers. That tells us that our perception of reality is really the result of our brain's organizing of the information it receives perceptually through the stimuluses that come in through our senses. This also means that it's limited to the capacities and abilities and the experience that we have as human beings. This means, if you stop to think about it, this means that nobody actually lives in reality in terms of experience. But we do live in reality in terms of reality itself. That is, our experience is one point of view, reality is a completely different point of view. I mean, for example, if I am going to accidentally dip my hand into some boiling water, I am going to do damage to the skin of my hand. And that is going to happen anyway because of the nature of water, its temperature when boiling, the nature of my skin and its ability to withstand the trauma of that kind of high heat. There are certain things that are just going to be what they're going to be because that's the way reality is. Now, it's quite possible that since I understand the damage that that hot water could do, that if I see water and I think it is really hot, but someone has caused through some other chemical present in it to make it look like it's boiling hot when it's not, I will not want to stick my hand in it, even though if I were to stick my hand in it, I wouldn't burn my fingers. And if somebody could, for example, if you can add alcohol or you can add other chemicals to water that cause it to not boil at the regular temperature because of the the mixture of things that are in there, and you can have water that's boiling hot and it doesn't look boiling hot, and you can stick your finger in that and it's still going to burn you. So there's a sense in which the point I'm trying to make with that is this, that we live our existence takes place in reality and cannot violate the laws of physics. It can't. It's going to do what it has to do given the nature of its very existence. There's nothing you can do about it. However, recognizing that perception is not the same as reality, we make our decisions based on what we think reality is. And that's not always a good idea. It really isn't. May seem strange, but it's not that. And many times we can find ourselves, as it were, metaphorically, getting burned. We thought this is what was going on. We responded to what was going on, and what happens? Ooh, it blows back up in our face. This can cause us to not be sure of what it is we think we see, and this can sometimes make us very much open to other people manipulating us and them telling us what reality is. And indeed, it's because of the difficulty that we can have in appreciating the difference between perception and reality, that we can become vulnerable to the manipulation and control of others when we don't realize what they're doing. But we don't live in reality in terms of experience. We live in perception. We go through this process of object recognition as we begin to organize the world, as we hear it, as we see it, as we feel it, as we hear it. And everything that we organize within our brains to make sense of reality requires our own personal context. And we actually learn cognitively to kind of make sense of the world by looking at things as they might be typically similar, or things as we come up with labels for things. We call things hot, we call things cold, we call things metal, we call things wood, we call things smart, we call things stupid. We have a lot of words that we use to help us organize the categories of the realities that we deal with. We even then look at certain behaviors and actions and sequences, and we come up with what we see as themes or as constant stories and things like this. And these too are also perceived. It may not be what's really going on, but it seems to us to be what's going on, and it ends up being what we see. Now, the odd thing is that as human beings, we find that when we discover something new, no human brain can look at something new and then immediately go, oh, look at that, something totally new. We can't do that. No human being does that. Whenever a human being looks at something new, they first see it as something they've always seen before, and then begin to discover that, hey, wait a minute, this isn't acting typically or thematically or objectively in the way that it should. And it takes a while of dissonance before they begin to discover and see this is something totally new. We tend to make sense of new things in light of what it is we already know. And when we discover that it doesn't make sense in that light, we then begin to allow it a new category. But as it turns out from psychological development, we only do that to the degree that we must. We still keep it categorically like other things as much as we can get away with. What this means, and basically what I'm saying is this: this is true of me, it's true of you, it's true of Joey, it's true of Dr. Jones, it's true of all the people who might be watching, whatever. We all live in a organization of reality that is a combination of astute observations and unaware distortions and exaggerations and labeling that actually oversimplifies, overgeneralizes, and as a result, we not only live in perception, not reality. Our perception is an oversimplification of that reality. I don't care how smart you are. Maybe you have an IQ of 165, maybe you have an IQ of 65. Either way, your perception of reality is an oversimplification of what that reality is. Reality has a higher resolution to it, as it were, than our human being brains can possibly organize it with, in spite of how brilliant some people might be, people such as Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's every time that guy opens up his mouth, it's just pure gold coming out. It's amazing, the intelligence and the insight and the awesomeness of that thinker. A very, very intelligent guy. Well, anyway, we live in perception, but must act in reality. This means that part of maturing as a human being means growing up and getting beyond the reaction principle. We don't want to experience things and then react to them. It doesn't do you any good. Everything that you experience is, of course, experienced perceptually. And everything that we experience is in some manner unknown to us, different from what we experience it to be. If it is a problem, we have to solve the problem that we have, not the problem that we think we have. Now, by the way, think about it. I have never talked to anybody who had a problem let me clarify this. I've talked to plenty of people who had problems, but I've never talked to anybody who had a problem where they said, you know what? I got this problem, Bob, and my problem is da 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 da, and we'll label that problem A. But because I don't like having problem A, and because I don't know what to do about problem A, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to pretend that I actually have problem B. And now I know how to solve problem B, so I'm going to pretend I have problem B, and then I'm going to solve that problem. In the words of Dr. Phil, and how's that working for you? That isn't going to work. And I've never met anybody who's going to tell me that. But I have met plenty of people who are doing things they think are going to solve their problems, and they're totally ineffective and don't do anything about their problem. Now, there can be a couple of reasons why they do that. One might be maybe they haven't learned yet how to actually deal with that problem, and they haven't discovered the kinds of things that are truly effective in dealing with that problem. And that definitely happens from time to time. But usually, particularly if I'm talking to an adult, I find that the real reason why they're caught up in ineffective responses to some of the problems they're solving is because it's their perception of their problem that is off. And they're not really being as stupid as it might seem they are. They're not really being as ineffective as it may seem they are. They might actually be doing the kinds of things that would make a ton of sense if the problem as they see it is actually the problem they're having. I mean, people do want to solve their problems. And as a result, they do things that they think are going to solve their problem. And not just because they think that, oh, this will solve that problem. They think this will solve this problem that they think they have when that's not the problem they have. I don't know if I lost you on that. But the point that I would hope you can see is this. Since we live in perception, not in reality, we also find ourselves facing the challenges of life. And we need to recognize that the challenges of life as we experience them truly may exist, but they do exist in a manner different from the way we experience them. And as a result, if we are going to do anything about our problems, we need to recognize that the most effective way of dealing with something we perceive as a challenge or a problem means finding a way of getting outside of perception in a verifiable, valid, wise manner that allows us to solve the problem as it is, not the problem that we think we're having. During my intro, I talked about the problem that a sound engineer might have of needing to tweak the EQ of a particular sound source because it seems to lack the bottom end. Well, what we have discovered through this Fletcher-Munson graph is that any sound that we're listening to that is quieter than 65 decibels will, to the human ear, sound to us as if it lacks a certain amount of bottom end and a certain amount of way upper end, and that this is just the way our ears hear it. But if you put a microphone in front of that sound source and then turn the microphone up properly through the preamp so that we can record it at an optimal level, the EQ curve that sound source actually has may then appear to our ears in the monitors in the control room to be a very different EQ curve. It's important to understand that. That's a situation where a person starts solving a problem that they only think they're having, and they're not having a problem. Back in the 60s, there were a lot of bands that recorded that didn't have these high-powered, ear-splitting amplifiers. And they recorded just wonderful, awesome tunes that sound great because by the time they get them into the microphones and into the mixing console and mix them up, they got some great sounds. Oh, just some wonderful sounds. But today, of course, one of the things that you might hear me complain about from time to time, there's a lot of guitar players that think, oh no, I need a lot more than 65 dB to make sure that the tone I'm getting out of my amp is good. And then they're wondering why 15 years later they're suffering radical hearing damage. But anyway, we need to solve the problems that we're having and not the problems we only think we're having. When we come at these problems of life, it's important that we recognize that before we react, that we respond with this recognition that there is this difference. What can you do about that? Well, first of all, I think that a wiser person realizes that when there's a problem to solve, they have to really ask themselves, first, does this just seem like a problem to me? And it really isn't. Maybe it's just, let's see, we have a viewer comment here. Let me see if I can find it. I'm actually finding this talk quite useful in my own struggles, not with perception reality, but with audio editing. Oh, wonderful. Great. I wish you could come and take my class. I love teaching this stuff. I'll tell you, this is my 8th year teaching at this college, and I just enjoy teaching this stuff. You get these students in there; they want to become sound engineers, and I just enjoy this being able to talk to them about it. I wish you could come in and join the class. It's great stuff. We talk a lot about psychoacoustics and the ways that it affects in the way we actually can use it to our benefit, not just in dealing with sounds as we think we hear them, but creating sounds that seem to be something they really aren't, for creating that illusion of awesomeness and magic. Anyhow. Back to the point that we're looking at here. So when I'm looking at the problems of life, one of the first things I really have to ask myself, is this really a problem, or is seeing this as a problem something that comes from merely the cognitive dissonance that I have in not being able to place this into my perceptual mold in a way where I think it ought to be fitting? Maybe my perceptual mold is distorted, and what I'm working with and looking at is really perfectly fine, and I need to change. Maybe I need to change my perception, my conclusions. A thoughtful thinker is a person who is willing to consider that kind of a possibility. And it is important in our development and in our maturity to really think about that. It shows you how glib it is when people just tell you, Jesus is the answer. But anyway, we need to consider the possibility that the problem is actually an illusion and not a problem. We need to consider the possibility that there is a problem here, but the problem is somewhere else than where it is perceived. And I'll tell you what, something human beings are really, you see this in politics a lot, you see this in sociology a lot, you see this in the immature, in the teenager, in the younger adult, many times. Many people, when they first perceive a problem, think that the problem is where you see it. I hear a rattle in the engine, and it sounds like, but you might want to talk to a mechanic. Many times a mechanic, when you hear a rattle coming from here, what it really is he's got some experience to tell you what's really going on. The fact that you only hear it over here, or you hear it when, could be something that is simply the way that that problem finally works its way out towards places where we can perceive it. The squeaky wheel, as it were, gets the oil when it could really be the bent axle that's the problem. And so we need to realize that there's a difference between problems as they manifest and problems as they exist at their root. And one of the hugest things that we do, we find that, for example, people will discover that, well, people don't handle a certain situation very well. And so what we need to do is we need to stop that situation from happening. I'm sorry, but that strikes me as being the same thing as saying, I don't believe in human beings. I think they're absolutely stupid idiots. And so since they're absolute stupid idiots, when they find themselves in situations they can't handle, let's keep them from getting into those situations. How about this? If we find that people are repeatedly dealing with a situation incorrectly, let's see if we can find a way to teach them what's really going on so they can grow. How about this? Oh, you're making a lot of mistakes with that. I want you to stop doing that. Your judgment seems to be very poor. We don't stop to think. Where does good judgment come from? As I understand it, good judgment comes from experience. Where does experience come from? Want to know? Experience comes from bad judgment. That's the way it is. So if you're making mistakes, what a waste of time to think about your mistakes as being, it's how useless it is to blame people for having made mistakes, blaming them for bad judgment, blaming them for other errors, blaming them for certain limitations, blaming them, I'll tell you what comes around goes around. What a useless waste of time to do that. Wouldn't it make far more sense and be far more productive that when mistakes are made, limitations are reached, when judgment is poor, that we pause and say, this is a wonderful opportunity. It really is. Let's see. What went wrong here? Okay, and now as you take a look at it, you can understand and appreciate what seduced you into that bad judgment, what seduced you into that mistake, how that happened, and you can actually learn something from this. After all, you've already had bad judgment. After all, you've already made a mistake. After all, there have already been outcomes and consequences you don't want to face again. You've already paid the price. Let me tell you something. I'm not going to go into a store and say, I'll tell you, some of these guitars are a little expensive. I'm not going to go into the store and say, oh, I'd like one of them country gentlemen's. Here's, like $3,000. Give me a country gentleman. Pay them the $3,000 and then walk out without the guitar. I'm not going to do that. That's stupid. Why make a mistake and then walk out without learning from it? What a waste of time. No, instead, you've paid your tuition. You've made the mistake. You've done the thing that was the result of bad judgment. Well, hey, you've paid the tuition. Now go get your education. Learn from it. And this can become a beautiful and wonderful opportunity. I think it was the other week we were talking with Phil. We love Phil, don't we? Tell me you love Phil. Tell Phil you love him, by the way. You can find him on Facebook. And a few people already have. They found pictures of him, and we love you, Phil, and he appreciates it. It means a lot to him. Anyhow, I think that when Phil was here, we were talking about it. This one time, I was talking to this young lady. This was back in 1982, 83, somewhere, and she was studying a class at college on. She took a class on Pascal, which was back then a very popular programming language, and she bombed. She didn't do it all well. And she had a tough teacher. I happen to know who her teacher was. And she was a tough teacher who really expected you to know your stuff. She wasn't going to push programs. And then she told me she was sitting there and she was crying and she was feeling bad. And I said, well, I asked her what was going on. And she talked to me about how she's bombing in the class and she was just feeling terrible. And I said, well, evidently Pascal isn't something you're good at. So I'm curious, what made you decide to take it? What about that course? Well, I just wanted to see if I could do something like that, and maybe if I should select computer science as my major. And my immediate reaction was, well, that's wonderful. I'm so glad you bombed at it. This is great. This is awesome. And of course, she's looking at me like I'm an idiot. And I told her, I said, look, you took this course to see if this was something you were going to do, something you could do, something that would be a good fit for you. And you have discovered it isn't. Aren't you so glad you know this? How brave of you to be able to take that step. I commend you for jumping out like this. This is wonderful. And by the time we're done with this conversation, I'm trying to get her to, get her education out of this thing that we call a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. She took the course to find out if this was something she could do. And she found out it doesn't seem to be. Well, now she knows not to waste her time moving in that direction. And that was, I think, a very useful, perhaps somewhat costly lesson, but she got it. And I think that sometimes when we're solving our problems, we need to realize that there really aren't any mistakes. It's just a way of looking at it. It's just a point of view. There are things that don't produce the outcomes we had hoped they would. Or there are things that produce outcomes we had not anticipated. Things are sometimes a little more complicated than we thought they would be. Well, great. Your experience now has taught you that, and you can take that and learn from that. I tell you, if you turn those experiences into learning moments, 10, 15 years down the road, you will have collected a great deal of insight and knowledge. Whereas if you shy away and run away every time you make a mistake or something blameworthy, say, well, I'm not going to do that again, and blame yourself and waste all your time putting it into some sort of perspective that puts you down and limits you, where are you going to be in 10, 15 years of doing that? Yeah, not very far. It's not going to work so well for you. Let me ask you this. Have any of you wasted a lot of your adult life doing that very thing? Are you listening to me? Well, this is wonderful. What a wonderful opportunity you have had to discover you shouldn't really do that. It isn't working for you. Now you know, and you have also seen the high cost you paid for it. Well, that's a good lesson to know. Let's start taking a different view of the things that don't turn out quite the way we had hoped. That's great. And if we do that, we can learn so much from it. It'll be so helpful, to kind of do that. Now, we need to consider alternate points of view. We need to discover that there are other people who have also had similar experiences of the kind of problems and challenges we're facing. And they might have, because of their own experience, some unique insights and some unique successes. And they can share with us things that Oh, I see. That can give us an entirely different point of view, so that we begin to see the problem in a new light and begin to see the solution in a new light. And we can now do something that's going to be far more effective. By the way, I hope you don't hear this as I'm talking about living your life successfully. Rah, rah, rah. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about living your life authentically, responding to things as they are, even though we experience them as we experience and perceive them, and finding a way of living responsibly in recognizing the difference between perception and reality. Oh, stop dealing with perception except other than what it is, perception. Start making sure that all the actions you take have a basis in reality outside of perception. You'll find that you'll make far better decisions. You'll make far better plans. You will not be as surprised by outcomes you can't really deal with if you do that. Here's also a great idea. Be inconsistent. When you got a problem you've been working on, and you've been doing this and doing that and doing this, and nothing was working, be inconsistent. And the reason I say that is this. Was it Einstein who said this? He said something like, we cannot solve the problems we have by using the same kind of thinking we used to create them. Obviously, many of the problems that we suffer come from the fact that if you're going to be responsible with your life, you're going to have to start admitting something. We created our own lives in some way or another. Sure, a lot of other people have been involved in it. Many other people have made decisions, and we have to live in a context created by others. But a lot of people are doing very differently in the same context than we are, and so we've got to recognize that we're playing a role in it. And many times the reason why our life has a certain theme to it and somebody else's life has a different theme, not always, but sometimes it can be because this is just the way we're thinking. They call it stinking thinking. That's what it is. So maybe I need to start being inconsistent and recognize that I have to start thinking in a different way than the way I typically do. And it's quite possible that the problems I'm suffering with are actually problems created by my thinking. And as long as I'm going to be thinking that way and believing what I believe and solving problems based on the way I perceive the world, I'm only going to just perpetuate that problem. That's all I'm going to do. So I need to, in some ways, be inconsistent, change what I'm doing. The other thing that I find that is helpful is what I call it, what if, what if, what if, what if. And each of those what ifs is very important. I don't like saying what if. I would rather say what if, what if, what if, what if. And what I mean by that is this. That sometimes we shy away from certain possibilities or challenges or responsibilities because we say, well, if I do that, what if that happens? Well, that might happen, it might not, but don't just stop there. Why don't you take this a little farther? There are other what ifs you can ask. Okay, so what if that happens? It's kind of like, what if I go and apply for this other job and it gets back to my current employer that I was looking for that job? Okay, well, what if that does happen? What could you do then? Well, and then I'd have to talk to them about it. Okay, and so what if you have to talk to them about it? What will you tell them? Okay, and if you tell them that, what will be their response? And what you do is you continue doing that what if to everything you can think of until you finally get to a point where it sort of resolves. And when you do that, you begin to discover that the initial what if you were worrying about doesn't even make any sense, isn't worth the worry or the problem. And if it does create a problem, you can deal with it in a productive manner, in a way that works. I remember... I shouldn't share that story. It involves somebody else whose confidence I shouldn't share. Anyway, but then there's the other what if problem that you got to do. So don't just ask what if. Ask what if, what if, what if, what if. What if you don't do it? What'll happen there? Okay, and then what if that happens? What happens next? And take that what if out as well. Work that out to its logical conclusion, and then look at your gain versus loss, your likelihood versus your non-likelihood at looking at these situations, and you may discover that you need to make your final decision based on the what ifs that are way out there, the fourth or the fifth or the sixth what if, instead of just the immediate what if. You'll discover that a lot of things in life are better solved by actually going through one particular phase that is not going to be so comfortable, not so liked, but it'll be worth it. So let's do it. Kind of like facing surgery. What if something goes wrong? It can happen. One of the things that my dad did that I always found to be amazing that he could do this. He did it better than most people. My dad had this philosophy that he was a going concern, is I think the way he put it. That is, when it came time for him to consider a surgery in his older years, he said, look, I'm either going to die or I'm going to live. If I'm going to die, then I guess it's over. But if I'm going to live, I'm going to need this surgery. So as a result, unless the doctors were absolutely certain that he was going to die if he had the surgery, he's up for the surgery. And he lived to be 92. And he went through a couple of surgeries there that we were thinking like, whoa, he had some stomach problems where he had a perforated bowel and there was other problems going on. As an old man, it wasn't necessarily working out well, but hey, he survived it and he moved on. Now, that's not to say that that'll happen for everyone, but his decisions were based upon, I plan on living a long time, and so I'm going to make my decisions as if that's what's going to happen. And if that isn't what's going to happen, well, then it doesn't matter what my decision is going to be that much. And if I am going to live that long, I certainly don't want to live that long debilitated. So so he looks at the total cost down the road and made his decisive decision without ever thinking twice about reconsidering it, because he knew what he wanted to do. He had a clear sense of all of those what ifs all the way down the line. That was something he did that really well, and I admired seeing that in him. It was amazing. The what if, what if, what if. A few other things that I think is also important to recognize in this problem of perception versus reality. There's one thing that I discovered in myself that I had to realize had something to do with my dignity, and that is this. When I'm trying to understand problems, one thing I discovered is that there might be a problem with the way I'm seeing things. There might be a problem with the way I'm doing things. There might be a problem with the way someone else is seeing something or the way they're doing something. There may be a problem in our communication. But there's one thing that will never, ever, 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 ever be a problem. It is never a problem that I am who I am. What if I don't know things I need to know? Well, that's not a problem of my being. That's a problem of I got to learn something. It is never a problem that I am inadequate to life, that I am an unacceptable person, that my existence is somehow a mistake, and there isn't a single human being in this world who's entitled to my being a different person than the one I am. Now, if I can be a better person, I can be a better person, but I can't be a better person until I become a better person. So even though there may be other problems to solve, it is never a problem, ever, for you, me, or anybody to be who it is that they are. It may be a good place that they're at, but they need to move to a better place. And the only way to get to a better place from where you are at is to start where you are. And if where you are starting from is an issue for you, that's going to get in your way. So it has to be a non-issue. It is never a problem that you are who you are. It might be a problem that you stay there, and it really might not have the kind of outcomes you want, but here's a great, wonderful opportunity for learning something. That's something important to do. Compromise. Be multi-axial. And I'm out of time. What I really mean by that is look at things from a variety of standpoints and realize that I may never really understand this thing called reality. All I may ever come up with is a collection of possible perceptions. I don't have to know everything for certain or sure. The myth of certainty is going to work against you. Play the odds, work against it, guess sometimes. experiment, trial and error, learn from experience. Anyhow, that's a few of the musings I have to say about perception and reality. I hope you got something out of it. I know it's thinking this way changed my life in the way that I used to struggle in ways that just didn't work. And now I like being me. I like living the life that I live. I like the challenges I face. I feel adequate to them. Anyway, we'll talk to you later. I'm Bob Greaves, the Unconventional Pastor. See you later. Take care.
Ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned. In just a moment, on the Florida NCG studio stage, Dr. Jones will be speaking with the Cult of Honesty in Google Hangouts in just a moment, so stay tuned.